And so there's a hint there. It's so interesting. There's a hint there right at the beginning of the story that the state of being that Adam and Eve inhabited before they fell, before they became conscious, insofar as they were made in the image of God and acting out the truth, that being itself was properly balanced. And it takes the entire Bible to rediscover that, which is a journey back to the beginning, right? And that's a classic theme. It's a classic mythological theme, that the wise person is the person who finds what they lost in childhood and regains it, right? I think that's a Jewish idea, that Zadok, if I remember correctly, who is a Messiah figure, is the person who finds what he lost in childhood and regains it. His idea of this return to the beginning, except that the return is you don't fall backwards into childhood and unconsciousness. You return voluntarily to the state of childhood, well awake, and then determined to participate through truth in the manifestation of proper being. Now, you know, I'm a psychologist and I've taught personality theory for a very long time, and I know personality theories, the profound personality theories, pretty well, and I'm reasonably well versed in philosophy, although not as well versed as I should be. But I can tell you, in all the things I've ever read or encountered or thought about, I have never once found an idea that matches that in terms of profundity, but not only profundity, also in believability. Because the other thing I see as a clinician, and I think this is very characteristic of clinical experience and also very much described explicitly by the great clinicians, is that what cures in therapy is truth. That's the curative. Now there's exposure to the things you're afraid of and avoiding as well, but I would say that's a form of enacted truth, because if you know there's something you should do by your own set of rules and you're avoiding it, then you're enacting a lie. You know, you're not telling one, but you're acting one out. It's the same damn thing. So if I can get you to face what it is that you're confronting that you know you shouldn't be avoiding, then what's happening is that we're both partaking in the process of attempting you to act out your deepest truth. And what happens is that improves people's lives, and it improves them radically. And the evidence, the clinical evidence for that is overwhelming. We know that if you expose people to the things they're afraid of, but that they're avoiding, they get better. And you have to do it carefully and cautiously and with their own participation and all of that. But of all the things that clinicians have established that's credible, that's number one. And that's nested inside this deeper realization that the clinical experience is redemptive, let's say, because it's designed to address suffering, insofar as the people who are engaged in the process are both telling each other the truth. And then you think, well, obviously, because if you have some problems and you come to talk to me about them, well, first of all, just by coming to talk to me about them, you've admitted that they exist. Man, that's a pretty good start. And second, well, if you tell me about them, then we know what they are. And then if we know what they are, we can maybe start to lay out some solutions, and then you can go act out the solutions and see if they work. But if you don't admit they're there and you won't tell me what they are, and I don't, and I'm like posturing and acting egotistically and taking the upper hand and all of that in our discussions, well, how the hell is that going to work? You know, it might be comfortable moment to moment while we stay encapsulated in our delusion, but it's not going to work. So a lot of that seems, if you think it through, it seems pretty self-evident. And, you know, Freud thought that repression was at the heart of much mental suffering. The difference between repression and deception is a matter of degree, and that's all. It's technical. It's a technical differentiation. And Alfred Adler, who was one of Freud's greatest associates, let's say, and much underappreciated, I would say, he thought that people got into problems because they started to act out a life lie. That's what he called it, a life lie. That's worth looking up, because Adler, although not as charismatic as Freud, was very practical and really foreshadowed a lot of later developments in cybernetic theory. And of course, Jung believed that you could bypass psychotherapy entirely by merely making a proper moral effort in your own life. And Carl Rogers believed that it was honest communication mediated through dialogue that had redemptive consequences, and the behaviorists believe that you do a careful microanalysis of the problems that are laid before you and help introduce people to what they're avoiding. It's like all of those things to me are just secular variations of the notion that truth will set you free, essentially. So you know, it's a pretty powerful story. And A, it's not that easy to dispense with, and B, the other thing is you dispense with it at your peril, because what I have seen as well is that the people that I've seen who've been really hurt have been hurt mostly by deceit. And that's also worth thinking about, that, you know, you get walloped by life. There's no doubt about that. There's absolutely no doubt about that. But I've thought for a long time that maybe people can handle earthquakes and cancer and even death, maybe, but they can't handle betrayal and they can't handle deception. They can't handle having the rug pulled out from underneath them by people that they love and trust. That just does them in. You know, it makes them ill, but it hurts them, you know, psychophysiologically. It damages them. But more than that, it makes them cynical and bitter and vicious and resentful. And then they also start to act all that out in the world, and that makes it worse. So you know, the story starts, God uses the spoken truth to create being that is good. And then the cataclysm occurs. And then human beings spend untold millennia trying to sort out exactly what to do about the fact that they've become self-conscious. And, you know, by the way, we have, right? We are, in fact, self-conscious. No other animal has that distinction. Now, you'll read that chimpanzees can, for example, if you put lipstick on a chimpanzee, it's kind of a strange thing to do. Yeah. Well, I won't pursue that any further. But the chimpanzee will wipe off the lipstick if you show it a mirror. And dolphins seem to be able to recognize themselves in mirrors. And there is the glimmerings of self-conscious recognition in other animals. But to put that in the same conceptual category as human self-consciousness is, to my way of thinking, it's uninformed to say the least, but I also think that it's motivated. It's motivated by a kind of anti-humanistic underlying motivation, because our self-consciousness is so incredibly developed compared to that they're hardly in the same conceptual universe. It's like comparing the alarm cries of vervet monkeys when they see a predator to the language of human beings. It's like, yeah, there's some similarities, man. There are utterances, and there are utterances with meaning, but they're not language. And the self-consciousness of animals is proto-self-consciousness, and it's only there in a very small number of animals. And it's nothing like ours. They're not aware of the future like we are. They're not aware of their boundaries in space and time. And that's the critical thing, and most particularly time. Human beings discovered time. And when we discovered time, we discovered the end of each of our being. And that made all the difference. And that's what the story of Adam and Eve is about. So Genesis 1 is derived from the priestly source, where God is known as Elohim or El Shaddai. And there's God in the singular, and there's gods in the plural. And I suppose that's because it seems that if you analyze the history of the development of monotheistic ideas, that monotheism emerges out of a plurality of gods. And as I mentioned, I think it's because the gods represent fundamental forces at minimum, and those fundamental forces have to be hierarchically organized with something absolute at the top, because otherwise they do nothing but war, right? You have to organize your values hierarchically or you stay confused. And that's true if you're an individual, and it's true if you're a state. If you don't know what the next thing you should do is, then there's 50 things you should do, and then how are you going to do any of them? You can't. You have to prioritize. Something has to be above something else. It has to be arranged in a hierarchy for it not to be chaotic. And so there's some principle at the top of the hierarchy, and maybe the organization of the gods over time. That's the battle of gods that Mircea Eliade talked about. And if you're interested in that, you could read A History of Religious Ideas, which I would really recommend. It's a 3-volume book. It's actually quite a straightforward read as far as these things go. And Eliade does a very nice job of describing how and even why polytheism tends towards monotheism. Even in polytheistic cultures, there's a strong tendency for the gods to organize themselves in a hierarchy with one god at the top. In a monotheistic culture, in some sense, all the other gods just disappear across time, and there's nothing left but the top god. But even in a polytheistic society, there's a hierarchy of power among the gods. Thank you.